It was a crisp, quiet morning in the affluent suburb of Greenwich, Connecticut, when Arthur Sterling, a man who had spent 40 years as a master of forensic accounting, heard a truth that no ledger could ever prepare him for. His neighbor, a retired judge named Silas, pulled him aside with a hauntingly grave expression. "Artie, I have to tell you something critical," he whispered. "Your wife and your daughter are concealing a betrayal beyond your darkest imaginings. A man, a stranger, slips into your estate every single time you leave for your weekend fishing trips." In that heartbeat, Arthur's world tilted, but his analytical mind took over. He didn't confront them. Instead, he conducted a surveillance audit, secretly wiring his home with high-definition hidden cameras. But when he finally sat down to review the footage, the breath left his lungs at the sight of the man on the screen. His heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, yet a cold, calculating calm quickly replaced the pain. He realized then that his entire life had been a fraudulent balance sheet, and soon, he would make them pay, with heavy interest, for the lies they had spent like currency for decades. Arthur stared at the monitor in his soundproofed basement study, his eyes fixed on the digital timestamp glowing in the corner of the screen. It marked 2:15 in the morning of the previous Friday. He watched the man on the recording use a key to enter the front door, a key Arthur had paid a locksmith to cut years ago for emergencies. The stranger moved through the foyer with the practiced ease of someone who owned the deed to the property. For 4 decades, Arthur had built his reputation on finding the missing cents in million-dollar discrepancies, but he had somehow missed the massive deficit growing in his own living room. The footage was undeniable and agonizingly clear. He watched his wife, Lydia, greet the man with a lingering kiss that contained a passion she had stopped showing Arthur more than 10 years ago. Then came Cassidy, their 35-year-old daughter, who walked into the frame with a bright smile. She did not look shocked or offended by the intruder. Instead, she laughed and handed the man a glass of aged scotch from Arthur's private collection. She looked at the visitor with the warmth of a child looking at a beloved patriarch, a look she usually reserved for the man she called father. The realization hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow to the chest. This was not a sudden moment of weakness or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was a coordinated, long-term operation. In the world of forensic accounting, this was systemic fraud, a conspiracy to misappropriate his life, his home, and his legacy. Arthur took a deep breath, forcing the air into his lungs until his ribs ached. He leaned back in his leather chair and closed his eyes for exactly 60 seconds. When he opened them, the tears were gone, replaced by the icy clarity that had once made him the most feared auditor on the East Coast. He rose from his desk and climbed the stairs to the main floor of the mansion. The smell of expensive jasmine candles and roasting lamb filled the hallway, creating a scene of domestic perfection that would have fooled any ordinary man. Lydia was in the kitchen, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, humming a soft melody as she adjusted a vase of fresh lilies. Cassidy sat at the mahogany dining table, scrolling through her phone and looking every bit the successful socialite she pretended to be. "Evening, dear," Lydia said, her voice like honey as she turned to face him. "You were in the basement a long time. Is everything all right with those old files you were reviewing?" Arthur looked at her, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the way she avoided direct eye contact, details he had been too blinded by love to notice before. He looked at Cassidy, who gave him a bright, artificial smile that did not reach her eyes. He felt a wave of nausea, but he mastered it with the discipline of a man who knew how to hide his best cards. He was no longer just a husband or a father. He was a lead investigator gathering evidence for a final liquidation. "Everything is fine," Arthur replied, his voice steady and neutral. "I was just clearing out some old accounts that were long past due. I was actually thinking of heading up to the cabin in Maine this coming Friday." The trout should be biting, and I could use the fresh air and the silence." Lydia's eyes brightened with a relief that was almost comical in its transparency. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, Artie. You have been working so hard lately. You should stay as long as you need to feel refreshed. Cassidy and I will be just fine here holding down the fort." Arthur watched his daughter nod in enthusiastic agreement, her thumb already dancing across her phone screen, likely sending a message to the man Arthur had just seen on the monitor. He gave them a small, tight smile. He would give them the space they wanted. He would give them the silence they needed to feel safe. And while they celebrated their perceived victory over the aging man they thought was a fool, he would begin the process of auditing every lie they had ever told him. The ledger of his life was out of balance, and he would not stop until the final total was settled in full. He walked toward the coat rack, his mind already moving to the next phase of the investigation. The audit had officially begun, and there would be no mercy for the fraudulent. Arthur returned to the cold sanctuary of the basement, the air down there feeling more honest than the perfumed lies circulating on the floors above. He sat in the ergonomic chair and gripped the mouse with a hand that had finally stopped shaking. He rewound the ultra-high-definition footage, pausing the frame at 2:17 in the morning. With a few precise clicks, he zoomed in on the intruder's face as the man leaned into the kitchen light to inspect a bottle of vintage Bordeaux. The pixels tightened, the blur vanished, and a face emerged that had been part of Arthur's inner circle for 40 years. Julian Vane. The identification felt like a slow-acting poison spreading through Arthur's veins. Julian was not just a friend, he was the best man at Arthur's wedding, the godfather to Cassidy, and the primary legal counsel for every Sterling family venture since 1986. They had survived law school together, toasted to first million-dollar deals together, and shared countless cigars on the porch of the very house Julian was now infiltrating like a thief in the night. Arthur watched the screen with a clinical detachment that masked the howling void in his soul. He saw Lydia walk into the kitchen, her silk robe draped loosely over her shoulders. She didn't just greet Julian, she moved into his space with a familiarity that suggested she had forgotten Arthur even existed. The most agonizing moment came when Cassidy joined them. Arthur watched his daughter, the girl he had coached through every math competition and every heartbreak, walk right up to Julian and kiss him on the cheek. She called him Daddy J, a nickname that made Arthur's stomach churn with a sudden, violent nausea. There was no hesitation in her movements, no guilt in her eyes. The three of them stood in the kitchen like a nuclear family, laughing over a private joke while drinking the wine Arthur had purchased to celebrate his own 70th birthday. As a forensic accountant, Arthur began to look for the structural flaws in this hidden architecture. He pulled up his digital calendar on a second screen and started cross-referencing the dates of his weekend fishing trips to Maine over the past 3 years. A pattern emerged with sickening mathematical precision. Every single trip had been suggested or encouraged by Julian. It was Julian who would call on a Tuesday afternoon, mentioning that the trout were jumping or that the weather in the north was perfect for a few days of solitude. Julian would even offer to check on the property taxes or the estate filings while Arthur was gone, ensuring that Arthur felt his affairs were in good hands. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Julian had used his position as the family lawyer to audit Arthur's life, identifying the quiet windows and the empty hours to stage his own takeover. He wasn't just sleeping with Arthur's wife, he was managing Arthur's absence. Arthur watched the footage from 2 weeks prior, seeing Julian sit in Arthur's favorite armchair, feet propped up on the ottoman, while Lydia read him excerpts from the morning paper. They were living a second life inside the shell of his own, a parasite relationship that had hollowed him out without him ever sensing the decay. The betrayal extended beyond the emotional. Arthur recalled how Julian had recently pressured him to update the family trust, suggesting that Cassidy should have more immediate oversight of the liquid assets. At the time, Arthur had viewed it as a fatherly transition, a way to prepare his daughter for her inheritance. Now, seeing the way Cassidy whispered into Julian's ear, he realized he had been invited to sign his own financial death warrant. They weren't just waiting for him to go to Maine, they were waiting for him to go to the grave. Arthur's mind, trained to find the fraud in the most complex balance sheets, began to categorize the evidence. He opened a fresh digital folder and labeled it under a code name he used for his most high-stakes corporate investigations. He spent the next 4 hours clipping segments of video, documenting the times of entry, and recording every instance of Julian using his personal security codes. He watched Lydia hand Julian a stack of mail, watched Cassidy show him something on her laptop that looked suspiciously like a bank statement, and watched them all toast to a future that clearly didn't include him. The calm that had settled over Arthur earlier deepened into a frozen, unwavering resolve. He was 70 years old, a man the world thought was past his prime, a man his family viewed as a reliable ATM with a failing heartbeat. They thought he was a fool who lived in the past, but they had forgotten that Arthur Sterling had spent 40 years destroying people much smarter than them with nothing but a ledger and a pen. He wouldn't confront them with tears or accusations. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. Instead, he would conduct the most thorough audit of their lives, and when he was finished, he would liquidate every asset they possessed, including their dignity. He closed the video file and looked at the framed photograph of the three of them on his desk. He turned it face down. The man they knew was gone, replaced by the auditor they should have feared. He had 40 years of experience in finding what people tried to hide, and he was just getting started. Arthur turned his back on the glowing screen of the surveillance system and faced the double monitors where his professional life usually resided. For 40 years, he had been the man companies called when the numbers did not make sense, the man who could spot a ghost employee or a laundered million within an hour of looking at a general ledger. Now, he was applying those same surgical eyes to the bank statements of his own household. He logged into the Sterling Family Trust, using a master password that Lydia and Cassidy did not know he still possessed. He did not start with last week. He went back 10 years, setting the search parameters for any transaction over $5,000. The data began to populate the screen in a cold, orderly march of columns and rows. As he scrolled, the red flags started appearing, not as sudden spikes, but as a steady, rhythmic bleed of his net worth. He opened Lydia's primary credit card statements first. Over the past 5 years, he found over $200,000 in charges at high-end boutiques like Cartier and Van Cleef & Arpels. He remembered Lydia wearing a breathtaking emerald necklace to a gala 3 years ago. When he had complimented it, she told him it was a family heirloom from her late aunt's estate. Looking at the statement now, he saw the truth. The necklace had cost $45,000, paid for in 3 installments from a sub-account Arthur had set up for household emergencies. He then looked at her travel history. Every time he had been away at his cabin in Maine or attending a professional conference in Chicago, Lydia had been on her own adventures. She called them girls' trips or wellness retreats in Aspen and the Hamptons. But as Arthur cross-referenced the dates with the surveillance logs he had just seen and Julian's social media check-ins, the pattern was undeniable. Lydia was not at a spa. She was at 5-star resorts with Julian Vane, using Arthur's hard-earned money to fund the very romance that was destroying him. The audacity of it was breathtaking. She had even charged the room service and the couple's massages to their joint account, confident that the aging accountant would never look closely at the fine print of his own life. The investigation took a darker turn when he moved to Cassidy's accounts. Arthur had always been generous with his daughter, providing her with a monthly stipend of $10,000 to support her various charity projects and socialite lifestyle. He had believed her when she said her non-profit organization for underprivileged youth required significant capital for marketing and outreach. But as he audited the flow of funds, he saw that the money was not going to any charity. It was being funneled into a series of wire transfers to offshore accounts and domestic casinos. In August of last year alone, Cassidy had withdrawn $80,000 from the family contingency fund. Arthur had questioned her about it at the time, and she had cried, telling him there was a sudden crisis with a youth center in Bridgeport that needed immediate repairs. He had hugged her and told her not to worry. Now, he saw the wire confirmation from a casino in Atlantic City. His daughter was not a philanthropist. She was a high-stakes gambler with a hidden debt problem. Even worse, several large payments were marked as legal consultancy fees paid directly to the firm of Julian Vane. Julian was not just her daddy Jay, he was her financial fixer, helping her hide her losses from Arthur while charging his own exorbitant fees for the privilege. Arthur sat in the silence, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the spreadsheets. He felt like he was looking at the wreckage of a massive corporate fraud, but the toxic assets were the people he shared his breakfast with. He calculated the total misappropriation over the last decade. Between Lydia's secret luxuries and Cassidy's gambling debts, they had drained nearly $3 million of his personal wealth. This did not include the hundreds of thousands in legal fees he had paid Julian to protect a family that was actively predatory. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He was a master of forensic accounting who had been defrauded in his own home. He had been so focused on the integrity of the corporations he audited that he had failed to perform a simple due diligence on the woman he loved. He had treated his marriage like a blue-chip investment, assuming that the dividends of loyalty and affection were guaranteed. Instead, he had been pouring his life into a Ponzi scheme designed by his best friend and executed by his wife and daughter. Arthur opened a new spreadsheet and titled it The Final Liquidation. He began to categorize every fraudulent transaction, every lie, and every dollar stolen. He attached digital copies of the receipts and the wire confirmations to each entry. In the world of finance, a debt must always be settled, and Arthur was no longer in the business of forgiveness. He looked at the total at the bottom of the screen, a number that represented the price of 26 years of deception. He would not just ask for a divorce or an apology. He would treat this like a hostile takeover. He would move the assets, freeze the accounts, and leave them with nothing but the debts they had incurred in the shadows. As the sun began to rise over the manicured lawns of Greenwich, Arthur Sterling clicked save on the most important audit of his career. He was ready to move from investigation to execution. He would wait for the right moment to strike, but for now, he had the numbers, and the numbers never lied. Arthur sat in the dim light of the laundry room, his hands encased in thin latex gloves. He was not there to wash clothes. He was there to collect biological evidence. His professional training had taught him that once a major discrepancy was found in a primary account, the entire foundation of the entity had to be questioned. If Lydia and Julian had been conspiring for decades, then the most precious asset in Arthur's life, his daughter Cassidy, was no longer a verified entry. He held a small plastic evidence bag containing a crystal wine glass that Cassidy had left on the patio table only an hour before. He had watched her through the kitchen window as she laughed and sipped her expensive Chardonnay, her lipstick leaving a perfect, incriminating crescent on the rim. He drove to a private laboratory in downtown Stamford, a place he had used during high-stakes corporate litigation to verify signatures and biological markers in inheritance disputes. He paid the technician for the most expensive, expedited service available, a sum of $2,000 that he pulled from a secret cash reserve. As he handed over the bag, he felt a strange, cold detachment. He was 70 years old, and he was about to find out if the last 35 years of his life had been a complete fabrication. He told the technician he needed the results within 48 hours. The wait was a unique kind of torture. Arthur returned to the mansion in Greenwich and performed the role of the doting father and husband one last time. He watched Cassidy complain about a broken air conditioner in her apartment, a repair that would cost $5,000, and he watched himself write the check without a word of protest. Every time she called him Dad, the word felt like a serrated blade across his skin. He looked at her face, searching for any trace of his own features, his prominent jaw or his deep-set eyes. He found none. He saw only the elegant bone structure of Lydia and the arrogant, high-arched brows of Julian Vane. The suspicion was a poison that moved through his system, turning every memory of her childhood into a scene from a horror film. He remembered the night she was born in April of 1990. He remembered the overwhelming joy, the way he had cried as he held her for the first time in the sterile light of the hospital room. He had promised to protect her, to provide for her, and to ensure she never wanted for anything. He had kept that promise for more than 3 decades, pouring millions of dollars into her education, her failed business ventures, and her extravagant lifestyle. If the numbers on the coming report did not match, it meant he had spent his entire adult life building a legacy for a man who had stolen his wife and mocked his intelligence. On the second afternoon, the notification arrived on his encrypted mobile phone. Arthur was in his basement study, surrounded by the physical files of his career, when the screen lit up with a secure link to Gentech Labs. He did not open it immediately. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand perfectly steady, and sat down at his mahogany desk. He had faced down CEOs of multinational corporations and dismantled fraudulent empires worth billions. He was a master of the audit, and he knew that the truth was the only thing that mattered, no matter how much it burned. He clicked the link and entered the 12-digit access code. The document loaded slowly, a PDF filled with technical jargon and complex tables of genetic markers. He scrolled past the biological data, his eyes searching for the one figure that would define his past and his future. He found it at the bottom of the second page. The probability of paternity was 0.00%. The conclusion was stated in a single, clinical sentence. The tested male, Arthur Sterling, is excluded as the biological father of the tested child, Cassidy Sterling. Arthur leaned back, the air in the basement feeling suddenly thin and metallic. The numbers did not lie. He had spent 35 years raising Julian Vane's daughter. He had worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificed his health, and ignored his own dreams to provide a life of luxury for a child that did not carry a single strand of his DNA. He realized now that Lydia hadn't just cheated on him, she had turned him into a long-term, interest-free loan for Julian's biological legacy. He had been a placeholder, a useful dupe who paid the bills while Julian enjoyed the rewards of fatherhood without the responsibility. The pain was there, a deep and hollow ache in his chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by a terrifying, white-hot fury. He looked at the family portrait hanging on the wall, a picture taken at the country club last summer. They looked like the perfect American success story. Arthur felt a sudden urge to laugh, a dry and bitter sound that died in his throat. He had been a master of forensic accounting for 4 decades, and he had been the victim of the most successful long-term fraud in the history of the state. He closed the laptop and sat in the darkness for a long time. The shock was over, and the audit was no longer just about money or infidelity. It was about total annihilation. He had built this life with his own hands, and he would be the one to tear it down. He would not just leave them, he would liquidate them. Every cent he had ever given Cassidy, every luxury he had provided for Lydia, and every legal fee he had paid Julian would be clawed back with a vengeance they could not even imagine. He looked at his watch. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. Dinner would be served in an hour. He would sit at the table, he would eat the meal Lydia had prepared, and he would smile at the daughter who wasn't his. He would play the part for a few more days, but in his mind, he was already erasing them from the ledger. The balance was zero, and the final audit was about to become a criminal investigation. Arthur sat in the profound silence of his study, the blue light of the monitor casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. The 0% paternity result was a hollow victory of truth over a 35-year lie, but for a forensic accountant, a discrepancy this large required a source document. He needed to find the exact moment the fraud had been initiated. He spent the next 3 hours bypassing the security protocols of an old legacy backup drive he had moved from their first apartment in 1992. Hidden within a deep subfolder of encrypted personal files was a mirrored archive of Lydia's original Yahoo email account, a digital graveyard she likely believed had been deleted decades ago. He began his search in late 1989, 5 months before Cassidy was born. The first email he opened was dated September 14, 1989, sent from Julian Vane's law school account to Lydia. The subject line was simply a series of question marks. Arthur read the words, and his blood turned to ice. Julian had written that he could not be a father, that his career at the firm was just starting, and that a child would be a financial and social anchor he was not willing to drag. He told Lydia she had to find a solution that did not involve him, or he would disappear from her life entirely. Arthur clicked on Lydia's response, sent 4 days later. Her words were cold, surgical, and utterly devoid of the warmth he had spent 40 years believing was his alone. She told Julian to stop panicking. She wrote that she had already identified a candidate, a young junior accountant named Arthur Sterling whom she had met at a university mixer. She described Arthur as earnest, stable, and possessing a trusting heart that bordered on the pathetic. She noted that Arthur was on a fast track to a senior partnership and had a clean family history. Most importantly, she wrote that he looked at her with a kind of adoration that made him exceptionally easy to manipulate. Arthur leaned back, his breath hitching in his chest. He was looking at the blueprint of his own entrapment. He scrolled to an email from October 22, 1989. Lydia was reporting back to Julian like a field agent to a handler. She wrote that the proposal had happened the night before on the pier. She described how Arthur had knelt in the sand, his voice trembling with a sincerity she found tedious. She told Julian that when she broke the news of her pregnancy, claiming the child was his, Arthur had actually wept with joy. He had promised to marry her immediately, to cherish her, and to provide for the baby as if it were the greatest blessing of his life. Lydia's final sentence in that email was a chilling promise to Julian: he will pay for everything, and he will never suspect a thing because he is too good a man to imagine a woman could be this calculating. The archives continued through the early 90s, documenting a systematic conspiracy of convenience. There were mentions of secret meetings at motels during Arthur's late nights at the office during tax season. There were discussions about how much of Arthur's bonus should be diverted into a private rainy day fund for Lydia and Julian. They had treated his life like a resource to be mined, a steady, reliable stream of income that funded a biological family he was never truly a part of. Arthur saw emails where they mocked his predictable habits, his love for his routine, and his unwavering devotion to a daughter who was being raised to view him as nothing more than a high-yield savings account. One email from 1995 stood out with particular cruelty. Lydia told Julian that Cassidy was starting to look more like him every day. She joked that they needed to keep the house dimly lit so Arthur wouldn't notice the arch of the eyebrows or the shape of the nose. Julian had replied with a laugh, stating that as long as Arthur kept the ledger balanced and the checks cleared, he wouldn't care if the child turned out to be purple. They had gambled on his decency, and for 40 years, they had won every single hand. Arthur felt a strange sensation, a shedding of his former self. The man who had proposed on that pier, the man who had worked himself to the bone to provide for a family he thought was his, was effectively dead. He had been a project, a target, a safe harbor for a woman who wanted the prestige of a marriage and the passion of a secret lover. He realized that every anniversary, every birthday, and every holiday had been a staged performance for his benefit, a way to keep the audit from ever taking place. He closed the archive and sat in the total darkness. The fury was no longer a hot, blinding thing. It had cooled into a hard, obsidian resolve. He was a forensic accountant, and he had just uncovered 40 years of fraudulent activity. In the corporate world, when a fraud of this magnitude was discovered, the goal was no longer to save the company. The goal was to initiate a complete liquidation and ensure that the perpetrators were left with nothing but the criminal liability of their actions. He looked at the clock. It was nearly 3 in the morning. He would not sleep. Instead, he would begin the process of building the case that would strip them of every comfort they had stolen from him. They had chosen him because he was stable and easy to lead. They were about to learn that the most dangerous man in the world is the one who has spent his life quietly keeping track of exactly what everyone owes him. The time for reconciliation was over. The time for the final audit had arrived. Arthur sat in the back booth of a quiet diner in White Plains, the smell of burnt coffee and cheap vinyl providing a stark contrast to the polished mahogany of his Greenwich study. He had summoned 2 individuals who represented the peak of their respective fields: Victor Vance, a legal executioner known in the Manhattan courts as the Great White Shark, and Sarah Jenkins, a retired criminal investigator from the Internal Revenue Service. Arthur had saved Sarah's career in 2012 by uncovering the missing link in a complex money laundering case, and now he was calling in a favor that would settle the debt forever. He placed a manila folder on the table between them. It contained the distilled essence of 40 years of betrayal. Victor reviewed the 1989 emails first, his sharp eyes narrowing as he read Lydia's cold assessment of a young, naive Arthur Sterling. Sarah focused on the financial spreadsheets, her finger tracing the steady, rhythmic drain of the family trust into accounts managed by Julian Vane. For several minutes, the only sound in the booth was the distant clinking of silverware and the soft rustle of paper. "This is not just a divorce," Victor said, closing the folder and leaning back with a look of grim admiration. "This is a criminal conspiracy to defraud. In the state of Connecticut, we can seek a massive deviation from the standard 50-50 asset split based on the sheer scale of the paternity fraud and the duration of the financial deception. But I know you, Arthur. You do not want a fair settlement. You want a total liquidation." Arthur nodded, his expression as cold as the marble in his foyer. "I want them to feel the weight of every cent they stole. I want Julian's law license burned to ash, and I want Lydia and Cassidy to understand the exact market value of a 35-year lie." Sarah Jenkins leaned forward, her professional curiosity ignited by the complexity of the numbers. "If Julian has been moving your funds to cover Cassidy's gambling debts or his own firm's overhead, he has violated every fiduciary duty he owes you as your attorney. That is a felony. I can begin a private forensic audit of his firm's client trust accounts through my contacts. If he is as arrogant as these emails suggest, he has likely left a trail of breadcrumbs that lead directly to a jail cell." The strategy they developed was a masterpiece of financial warfare, a maneuver Arthur called the liquidity trap. He would not confront them yet. Instead, he would begin a quiet, surgical withdrawal of his individual assets. He had discovered a specific oversight in the trust documents Julian had drafted 35 years ago. Because Julian had been so confident in Arthur's blind trust, he had included a clause that allowed the primary grantor to move up to 75% of the liquid capital into a secondary management fund for the purpose of asset diversification without a secondary signature. Over the next week, Arthur moved $3,400,000 in small, calculated increments. He shifted the funds into a new entity he had established in his brother Matthew's name, an account that sat entirely outside of Julian's sphere of influence. He did this during his normal working hours, appearing to be nothing more than a retired accountant tidying up his portfolio. At night, he would sit at the dinner table with Lydia and Cassidy, watching them laugh and spend, knowing that the financial floor beneath their feet was being systematically removed. He also began a process of deceptive reinvestment. He instructed Julian to look into a series of high-risk international tech startups, companies Arthur knew were on the verge of total collapse. He told Julian he wanted to move a significant portion of the remaining joint funds into these ventures to secure Cassidy's future. It was a test of greed. As he expected, Julian encouraged the move with sickening enthusiasm, likely planning to skim a heavy commission off the top or divert a portion of the funds to cover his own firm's mounting debts. Every move Arthur made was documented and mirrored in a secure cloud server that only Victor and Sarah could access. He was no longer a husband or a father, he was the lead architect of a controlled demolition. He watched Julian come over for drinks on Thursday evening, smiling and slapping Arthur on the back while offering legal advice designed to further entangle Arthur's remaining wealth. Arthur accepted the advice with a nod and a polite smile, playing the part of the useful dupe to perfection. The feeling of being the predator instead of the prey was intoxicating. For 40 years, he had been the one being audited without his knowledge. Now, he was the one holding the magnifying glass. He spent his afternoons at the public library, a place where he could work without the risk of Lydia or Cassidy seeing his screen. He was drafting a series of civil complaints and criminal referrals that would be filed simultaneously with the divorce petition. He worked with the same meticulous attention to detail that had earned him a reputation for being the most feared auditor in the tri-state area. The emotional toll was heavy, but Arthur channeled it into the precision of his work. Every time he felt a wave of sadness for the daughter he thought he had, he would reread the 1989 email where Lydia called him a pathetic target. That cold, printed reality acted as a shield against his own sentimentality. He was stripping away the layers of his life like old, rotted wallpaper, revealing the structural damage beneath. By the time Friday evening arrived, Arthur had successfully protected over $4 million of his personal wealth. The joint accounts were now little more than empty shells, filled with just enough capital to prevent a sudden alert from the bank's automated systems. The A-team was in position. The legal fuse was lit. All Arthur needed now was the final confirmation of their ultimate treachery, a confirmation he knew they would provide the moment they thought he was safely tucked away at his cabin in Maine. He walked back into his house, his heart a cold stone in his chest, ready to play his role for one final act. He greeted Lydia with a kiss on the cheek that felt like a silent promise of the storm that was about to break. The final audit was no longer a plan, it was an inevitability. He was ready to settle the accounts once and for all. Arthur stood by the heavy oak front door on Friday morning, his fly fishing rod cased and ready. He wore his favorite weathered vest, the one Lydia always complained looked too shabby for a man of his stature. He played the part of the aging, distracted husband to perfection, fumbling for his truck keys and kissing Lydia on the cheek with a lingering, feigned tenderness. He told her the drive to Maine would take him at least 5 hours and that he planned to be on the water by sunset. Lydia smoothed his collar, her eyes shining with a counterfeit worry that he now recognized as pure, unadulterated anticipation. She told him to be careful of the slippery rocks and to call her when he arrived. Cassidy stood at the top of the stairs, leaning against the railing with a cup of coffee, waving a casual goodbye. She looked like a devoted daughter wishing her father a peaceful retreat, but to Arthur, she looked like a beneficiary counting the days until the policy matured. Arthur drove his SUV through the winding, tree-lined streets of Greenwich, making sure to maintain a steady speed toward the Interstate 95 ramp. He knew they would be watching his location through the shared family app on their phones. What they did not know was that Arthur had spent the previous evening at a specialized tech shop in Stamford. His phone was now transmitting a looped, pre-recorded GPS path that would show his vehicle traveling north toward the cabin in Maine. In reality, Arthur doubled back 10 minutes later, parking his car in the secure, underground garage of a luxury apartment complex owned by his brother, Matthew. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, entered a small, sterile unit filled with high-end monitoring equipment, and sat down in front of a wall of screens. The surveillance audit was about to reach its peak. The living room feed on the center monitor flickered to life. Julian Vane appeared in the frame less than 30 minutes after Arthur had cleared the neighborhood gates. He did not knock. He used his private key and walked into the foyer with the swagger of a man who had finally inherited the throne. Lydia met him in the center of the room, throwing her arms around his neck in a display of physical intimacy that made Arthur's jaw tighten until his teeth ached. He watched them on the 40-inch screen, the resolution so high that he could see the glint of the gold watch he had given Julian for his 50th birthday. They moved into the kitchen, where Cassidy was already waiting. She poured Julian a glass of the 30-year-old Macallan Arthur had been saving for his own retirement celebration. The three of them sat at the mahogany table, the very place where Arthur had spent 40 years providing for them. He hit the record button on his console, the digital counter beginning its silent, incriminating march. "Is the paperwork ready, Julian?" Lydia asked, her voice sharp and eager. "I am tired of playing the doting wife to a man who smells like fish and old ledgers. I want to move to the villa in St. Bart's by the end of the summer." Julian pulled a thick legal folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "Everything is in position, Lydia. The diversification strategy Arthur mentioned last week was the final piece of the puzzle. He effectively gave me a blank check to move the remaining liquid assets into the offshore shell companies we discussed. He thinks he is protecting Cassidy's future, but he is actually funding our retirement. Once the final transfer clears on Monday, the Sterling Trust will be a hollowed-out shell." Cassidy laughed, a cold and hollow sound that Arthur felt in the marrow of his bones. "He really is the perfect fool," she said, leaning back and sipping her scotch. "He spent 40 years auditing everyone else and never realized his own family was the biggest liability on his balance sheet. I almost feel sorry for him. Almost." The conversation took a darker turn that Arthur had not fully anticipated. He watched as Julian leaned forward, his expression becoming predatory. "We need to think about the long term," Julian said. "Even without the money, Arthur is still the legal owner of this estate. Divorce will be messy and could tie up the property in probate for years if he decides to be difficult." Lydia nodded slowly. "I have already started looking into the Silver Oaks facility in New Jersey. It is a high-end memory care unit. With your legal standing as his primary counsel and my position as his wife, we can easily argue that his recent behavior, the sudden obsession with his old files and his growing paranoia about his finances, are signs of early-onset dementia. We can have him committed for an evaluation within 30 days. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. They weren't just stealing his money, they were planning to steal his freedom. They wanted him locked away in a gilded cage, drugged and forgotten, while they spent his life's work on the other side of the world. It is for his own good, Cassidy added, her voice chillingly pragmatic. He is 70 years old. He shouldn't be living in this big house alone anyway. At Silver Oaks, he will have professional care. We can visit him once a year and tell him how much we appreciate everything he did for us. Julian toasted his glass toward the camera, unaware that he was looking directly into the eyes of the man he was trying to bury. To Arthur Sterling, he said with a smirk, "The greatest accountant I ever knew. May he find the peace he deserves in a room with no windows." Arthur sat in the darkness of the monitoring room, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the screens. He watched them for another 4 hours as they planned the details of their new life, discussing which of his cars they would keep and which pieces of art Julian would sell to pay off Cassidy's remaining gambling debts. He recorded every word, every laugh, and every clink of the glasses. He had over 10 hours of high-definition footage of a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud and elder abuse. In the world of forensic accounting, this was the smoking gun. He had moved from a suspicion to a confirmed deficit, and now he held the proof of intentional malice. He closed the recording software and saved the files to 3 separate encrypted drives. He looked at his watch. It was nearly midnight. He would stay in this room for another 2 days, collecting every last scrap of their arrogance. He was no longer just auditing their bank accounts, he was auditing their souls, and the result was a total moral bankruptcy. On Monday morning, Arthur Sterling would return from Maine, but he would not be the man who left. He would be the hammer that would shatter their world into a million unfixable pieces. The trap was set, and they had walked right into the center of the kill zone. Arthur leaned back and watched the screen, his heart a cold, steady beat of retribution. The final balance was almost due. The grand ballroom of the Sterling estate was a sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, illuminated by the warm glow of 3 massive crystal chandeliers. It was the night of the 46th wedding anniversary gala, an event that the Greenwich elite had marked on their calendars for months. Arthur stood near the arched mahogany entrance, a glass of mineral water in his hand, watching the performance of a lifetime. Lydia moved through the crowd with the grace of a queen, wearing a new shimmering silver gown that cost $12,000 of Arthur's hidden capital. Beside her, Julian Vane acted as the perfect family friend and legal advisor, his hand resting occasionally on Lydia's waist whenever Arthur was occupied with a guest. Cassidy was in her element, flitting between the children of hedge fund billionaires, her laughter ringing out across the room like a polished, hollow bell. Arthur felt like a ghost haunting his own celebration. He had returned from Maine 2 days prior, feigning a peaceful trip and a renewed sense of vigor. He had allowed Lydia to lead him through the final preparations for the gala, even nodding in agreement when Julian suggested they make a formal announcement about the new investment strategy during the evening's program. Every smile Arthur gave was a calculated entry in a ledger that was about to be closed. He checked his watch. It was exactly 9 o'clock. Victor Vance and Sarah Jenkins were positioned at the back of the room, blending in with the catering staff and legal associates. They carried the weight of the federal warrants and the civil petitions that would act as the executioner's blade. Arthur caught Victor's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It was time for the final audit to go public. Arthur stepped onto the small raised stage at the end of the ballroom, tapping a silver spoon against his glass. The room fell silent, the guests turning their expectant faces toward the patriarch of the Sterling family. Lydia and Julian moved to the front of the crowd, standing side by side, their expressions filled with a smug, predatory satisfaction. They believed they were about to witness the beginning of Arthur's public decline into the dementia they had so carefully fabricated. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice amplified by the professional sound system and carrying the authority of a man who had spent 40 years commanding boardrooms. Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate 40 years of what I believed was a life built on a foundation of integrity and love. They say that in accounting, the truth eventually finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep the burial. Tonight, instead of a traditional slideshow of memories, I want to share with you a tribute to the reality of the sterling legacy. He signaled to the technician in the booth. The lights dimmed, and a massive projection screen descended from the ceiling behind him. Lydia gave him a confused, tight smile, her hand reaching for Julian's arm in the darkness. The screen flickered to life, but it was not a wedding photo from 1986 that appeared. It was the ultra-high-definition footage from the kitchen 3 nights ago. The ballroom gasped as Julian's voice echoed through the speakers, crystal clear and chillingly arrogant. "He really is the perfect fool," the recording of Julian said, as he toasted the glass of 30-year-old scotch toward the camera. He spent 40 years auditing everyone else and never realized his own family was the biggest liability on his balance sheet. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of the recording. Arthur watched Lydia's face turn a sickly shade of gray in the flickering light of the screen. The footage cut to the moment Julian and Lydia discussed committing Arthur to the Silver Oaks Memory Care Unit. The elite of Greenwich, many of whom had known Arthur for decades, watched in horror as his wife and best friend plotted to drug him and steal his estate. Arthur did not stop there. He clicked a remote in his hand, and the video transitioned into a series of forensic overlays. Massive red numbers appeared on the screen, detailing the $3,400,000 Julian had embezzled from the family trust. The 1989 emails flashed in rapid succession, showing Lydia's original plan to trap Arthur into a marriage to hide her pregnancy with Julian's child. Finally, the paternity report from Gentech Labs appeared in giant, glowing letters, probability of paternity 0.00%. Lydia screamed, a raw and guttural sound that shattered the professional veneer of the evening. "Arthur, stop this. This is a mistake. You are sick. You are not thinking clearly." Julian stepped forward, his face twisted in a mask of desperate rage. "This is a violation of privacy, Arthur. I will have you in court for this. This footage is illegal." Victor Vance stepped into the light, flanked by 4 uniformed officers from the Greenwich Police Department and 2 plainclothes agents from the Internal Revenue Service. "Actually, Julian," Victor said, his voice cold and booming. "The footage was recorded in Arthur's primary residence with his full consent, and it is perfectly admissible in the criminal investigation into your firm's client trust accounts." Sarah Jenkins stepped toward Julian, producing a set of federal warrants. "Julian Vane, you are under arrest for federal tax evasion, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and the misappropriation of over $5 million in client funds. You have the right to remain silent." The guests parted like the Red Sea as the officers moved in, pinning Julian's arms behind his back and clicking the handcuffs into place. The gold watch Arthur had given him caught the light one last time before being obscured by the steel. Cassidy stood frozen in the center of the room, her wine glass shattering on the marble floor as Navarro, the process server, handed her the formal declaration of disinheritance. Arthur walked down from the stage, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of Lydia, who was trembling so violently she had to lean against a caterer's table for support. The emerald necklace was a cold weight around her neck, a symbol of the 40 years of theft she had mistaken for victory. "The audit is complete, Lydia," Arthur said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that only she could hear. "I have liquidated every account you ever touched. The house is mine. The money is gone. And the man you thought was a fool just finished the most successful investigation of his career. You have 72 hours to remove your personal items before the locks are changed." Arthur turned his back on her and walked toward the foyer, leaving the wreckage of his former life behind him. The gala was over, and the elite of Greenwich were already whispering, their phones out to record the downfall of the Sterling dynasty. Arthur did not care about the gossip or the scandal. He walked out into the cool night air, the heavy scent of lilies finally fading from his senses. The truth was out, the perpetrators were in custody, and for the first time in 40 years, the books were finally balanced. He was 70 years old, and though his heart was a landscape of jagged ruins, his integrity was intact. He walked toward his car, leaving the lights of the mansion to burn out in the darkness. The final audit had reached its conclusion, and the settlement would be absolute. The marble hallways of the Stamford Superior Court felt like a frozen tomb as Arthur Sterling walked toward courtroom 4B for the final decree. 2 months had passed since the night of the gala, and the legal machinery had moved with a relentless, grinding precision that even Arthur found impressive. He sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Victor Vance, while Lydia and Cassidy sat 10 feet away, looking like hollowed-out versions of the women who had once dominated his life. Julian Vane was absent, currently being held without bail in a federal detention center while his legal team struggled to navigate the 34 counts of wire fraud and embezzlement that Sarah Jenkins had meticulously documented. Judge Elena Martinez did not waste time with pleasantries. She had spent 48 hours reviewing the 14 hours of surveillance footage, the 1989 email archives, and the 0.00% paternity results. When she spoke, her voice held a cold, sharp edge that cut through the stifling air of the courtroom. She stated that in her 30 years on the bench, she had never witnessed a more calculated or prolonged case of paternity fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The ruling was a total financial liquidation. Under the rare provisions for egregious fault and fraudulent inducement, Judge Martinez awarded Arthur Sterling 90% of the total marital assets. The Greenwich estate, valued at $7,800,000, was granted solely to Arthur. Lydia was ordered to vacate the premises within 48 hours with nothing but her premarital personal effects. Because of the documented conspiracy to defraud, the judge denied Lydia any form of spousal maintenance, effectively leaving a 65-year-old woman with no career history and no savings to fend for herself in one of the most expensive zip codes in the country. Arthur watched Lydia's face as the reality of the judgment settled in. The mask of aristocratic poise had shattered, leaving behind a terrified, aging woman who had spent 40 years believing she was untouchable. Cassidy fared no better. The court upheld Arthur's petition for total disinheritance, removing her name from every trust, insurance policy, and property deed. Because she had been an active participant in a concealment of the fraud and had accepted monthly payments from Julian Vane to facilitate the deception, she was also ordered to pay $500,000 in restitution to Arthur for the misappropriated funds she had used for her gambling debts. The most devastating blow for Cassidy came an hour after the court adjourned. While Victor Vance was finalizing the seizure of the remaining joint accounts, he handed Cassidy a single sheet of paper. It was a summary of the Julian Vane client trust account, the one Cassidy believed held her private $750,000 inheritance from her maternal grandmother. The document showed that the account was empty. Julian had not been protecting her future, he had been liquidating it. Over the past 5 years, he had drained every cent of her inheritance to cover his own firm's overhead and his failed investments in offshore tech startups. Cassidy collapsed onto a wooden bench in the hallway, the paper fluttering to the floor. The man she had called Daddy J, the biological father she had betrayed Arthur to protect, had treated her with the same predatory indifference he had shown Arthur. She had traded a devoted, loving father for a biological sire who saw her as just another account to be audited and emptied. She looked up at Arthur as he walked toward the exit, her eyes filled with a desperate, childlike plea for mercy. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know he was taking my money too. I have nowhere to go. I have no money left." Arthur stopped and looked at her, his expression as unyielding as a closing balance sheet. "I loved the daughter I thought I had for 26 years, he said, his voice low and devoid of any heat. "That girl died the moment I watched you laugh about committing me to a memory care unit so you could spend my money. You are not my daughter, Cassidy. You are a fraudulent entry in a ledger I have finally closed." He turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing with a rhythmic, final certainty. He drove back to the Greenwich estate one last time to oversee the eviction. He stood on the manicured lawn as two private security guards watched Lydia and Cassidy load a few suitcases into a 10-year-old sedan they had managed to keep in Cassidy's name. There were no tears from Arthur, only a profound sense of mathematical justice. He watched them drive out of the gates, two women who had built a 40-year empire on a foundation of lies, now heading toward a one-bedroom rental in a forgotten corner of the state. That evening, Arthur sat in his basement study and opened the final report from Victor Vance. Every account had been frozen, every asset had been appraised, and every debt had been assigned to the perpetrators. The restitution payments from Lydia's future wages and Julian's seized firm assets would continue for the next 20 years. It was a total victory, a clean audit of a corrupted life. Arthur picked up a red pen and drew a single, thick line through the names of Lydia and Cassidy on his personal estate map. The accounts were settled. The deficit was gone. He looked at the empty house around him and realized that for the first time in 4 decades, he was no longer a victim of a fraud he couldn't see. He was the sole owner of his truth, and the cost of that clarity had been every lie he had ever loved. He closed the file and walked toward the stairs, ready to face the final chapter of his life with a clean slate and a balanced heart. Arthur stood on the rooftop terrace of his new 2-bedroom condominium in downtown Stamford, looking out at the Long Island Sound as the sun dipped below the horizon. The glass and steel of his new home felt clean, honest, and entirely devoid of the ghosts that had haunted the hallways of the Greenwich estate. He had sold the mansion for $7,800,000, a transaction that had closed exactly 14 days ago. He had given a significant portion of the proceeds to a local nonprofit that provided legal aid to victims of elder abuse and financial fraud, keeping only what he needed to live a life of quiet dignity. Lydia and Cassidy were now mere footnotes in a history he had finally archived. According to the last report from Victor Vance, Lydia was working as a part-time receptionist at a dental clinic, earning $32,000 a year while living in a 1-bedroom apartment that cost $1,800 a month. The restitution payments to Arthur took nearly 40% of her take-home pay, a mathematical reality that would define the rest of her life. Cassidy was struggling to maintain her socialite image while working as a junior clerk at a retail chain, her $500,000 debt to Arthur hanging over her head like a permanent shadow. Julian Vane had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, his law license revoked and his reputation erased from the annals of the Connecticut bar. Arthur realized that the hardest part of the audit was not the financial liquidation, but the internal reconciliation. He had spent 40 years believing in a family that was a masterpiece of forgery. He had been a man who loved the idea of a daughter more than the reality of the woman she had become. But as the cool evening air brushed against his face, he felt a profound sense of lightness. The books were balanced. There were no hidden liabilities, no unrecorded debts, and no fraudulent entries in the ledger of his soul. He had traded a mansion full of lies for a small space filled with truth, and the exchange was the most profitable deal of his life. All debts were paid. The balance was zero. He was 70 years old, and finally, he was free. This story of Arthur Sterling and the final audit teaches us a powerful lesson about the nature of trust and the value of integrity. It reminds us that love without honesty is not a relationship, it is a form of emotional debt that eventually comes due. Truth may be a jagged and painful thing to encounter after decades of deception, but it is the only foundation upon which a life of dignity can be built. We learn that it is never too late to reclaim your self-respect and that the numbers of our lives must always be audited with courage. We are truly honored that you have stayed with us through this emotionally charged journey of Arthur's redemption. If this narrative touched your heart or made you reflect on the importance of transparency in your own life, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Please like and share this video with those who might find strength in its message, as your support helps us bring you more compelling stories of justice and human resilience every day. We want to hear from you. How did Arthur's story make you feel, and have you ever encountered a situation where the truth changed everything you thought you knew? We encourage you to share your thoughts and your own life experiences in the comments below. We truly value listening to your feelings from the deep center of your hearts. We wish each and every one of you watching this video today excellent health, a joyful life, and a heart full of peace every single day. Thank you for being a part of our community. Goodbye and see you in the next video.